Beneath the dim glow of oil lamps, the air in ancient Mesopotamia carried the scent of baked clay and river silt. The hum of daily life echoed through narrow streets, scribes scratching tablets, merchants haggling in the dust, farmers guiding oxen beneath the relentless sun. Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through history. Tonight we slip softly into the world of the very first cities, where mighty rivers gave birth to civilization, but survival was far from easy. Mesopotamia holds wonders, like the first written words and bustling markets, but also dangers you might not expect. Harsh laws, unpredictable floods, and daily struggles that would test even the strongest among us. So settle in, let your mind drift back across millennia, and together we'll uncover the hidden challenges of a place often called the cradle of civilization. And if you enjoy these quiet travels through the past, feel free to like, subscribe, or share your thoughts in the comments. It helps keep our little nighttime history circle growing. And before we begin, tell me, in comments, from which country are you listening tonight, and what time is it where you are right now? Imagine just for a moment that you're standing in the middle of ancient Mesopotamia. The sun is not simply shining. It is merciless, punishing, and unyielding. This is no kind warmth, no golden glow of a pleasant summer day. This is heat that crushes you beneath its weight, a furnace that breathes down on you without pause. You feel it clawing at your skin, tightening around your chest, daring you to draw another breath. And the word unbearable suddenly feels far too gentle, too polite for what you're enduring. The ground beneath your feet is baked solid, every step pressing against stone and clay that holds the memory of fire. Sandals grow hot, toes burn, and you begin to wonder if the earth itself has turned against you. Around you, people move slowly, cautiously, as though any sudden gesture might ignite the air. Farmers bend over their fields with backs that already ache, pulling water from canals that seem to evaporate before their eyes. Sweat forms on their brows, but it never lingers. It vanishes, snatched away by the dry, hungry air. The city, too, groans under the weight of this sun. Narrow streets feel like corridors of heat, trapping every breath, amplifying every shimmer of light. Children attempt their games in the alleys, but even their laughter sounds weaker, thinner, as though scorched by the atmosphere itself. A stray dog curls in a patch of shade against a wall, ribs visible, tongue hanging, its eyes half closed in quiet defeat. Shade here is not comfort, it is survival. You reach for water, and even that betrays you. The clay jug is warm to the touch, the liquid inside more like broth than relief. You drink, but the dryness in your throat returns instantly, cruel and insistent. Your lips crack. Your tongue feels like sandpaper. Breathing becomes an effort, shallow and deliberate, as though each inhale must fight through a wall of heated air. And yet the people endure. They rise before dawn, racing the sun, working quickly before its wrath becomes too fierce. They wrap their heads in cloth, cover their bodies in simple garments of wool and linen, hoping to shield skin from the burning rays. Still, the sun always wins. By midday, labour slows to a crawl, voices drop to whispers, and life itself seems to hold its breath, waiting for evening's fragile mercy. This is not the kind of heat you can simply grow used to. It is hostile, aggressive, almost alive in its cruelty. It strips you of energy, of patience, even of dignity. Your body protests with dizziness, with pounding temples, with an exhaustion that feels like surrender. And if you think you can endure it, if you believe a single day is manageable, you are mistaken. You are not built for this. Not for this kind of merciless blaze. Perhaps you laugh at your own misery, a dry laugh, because humour feels like the only weapon left. You joke to yourself that even your shadow looks tired, dragging its feet across the scorched earth. But the truth settles in heavy. This is only the first part of the day, and the night will bring its own cruelty. For now, though, you squint into the blinding horizon, sweatless but thirsty, weary but restless, and you begin to understand why life in Mesopotamia was never gentle, never easy, never safe. The sun itself was an enemy, one that returned every morning, unforgiving, unstoppable, and absolute. As if the merciless sun were not enough, Mesopotamia had another enemy waiting in silence, An enemy that arrived without warning, riding the horizon in waves of brown and gold. The dust storms, the winds. You hear them before you see them. A low growl, a whisper that grows into a roar, rattling reeds, shaking shutters, and pulling loose the very breath from your lungs. Then, on the horizon, the faint shimmer of movement. Not water, not clouds, but a wall. A wall of dust, creeping closer, stretching higher, swelling until it blots out the line between earth and sky, and then it strikes. The air becomes a weapon, filled with a billion tiny knives of sand. Your eyes sting, water, and close against your will. Your mouth fills with grit before you even realize it, teeth grinding on earth, tongue thick with bitterness. Every uncovered inch of skin feels scoured raw, as though the storm itself is determined to strip you down to bone. You cough, you choke, and yet the wind finds its way inside, curling down your throat, clawing its way into your chest. People scatter, rushing to pull fabric over their faces, to tie cloth across their mouths, to drag animals and children indoors. Doors slam, shutters rattle, and yet dust still seeps in, slipping through every crack, coating walls, floors, and lungs in a fine, merciless powder. There is no true escape, only endurance. The storm howls like a furious god, sweeping across fields and canals, bending palms until they creak, tearing at crops that already struggle beneath the sun. Irrigation ditches clog with silt, roofs lose tiles, and carts are overturned like toys. The carefully planted rows of barley blur, vanish, become nothing but chaos under the storm's fist. And in this chaos there is a strange rhythm, a strange hum. The sound of the wind is constant, endless, heavy, pressing against your ears until thought itself becomes muffled. It is frightening, yes, but also hypnotic. The dust wraps around you a suffocating cloak, and you feel smaller, weaker, a mere speck beneath a sky gone brown. It lasts minutes, sometimes hours, occasionally days. Time stretches, blurs, becomes meaningless. Your body aches with stillness, with waiting, with helplessness. And when at last the storm passes, it leaves behind a silence so sharp it feels unnatural. The ground is coated, the air is heavy, and your skin, your clothes, your very breath are lined with earth. You do not escape a dust storm. You survive it, half buried, half blind, half broken. And still the people continue. They sweep their courtyards, clear their canals, shake the silt from their beds. They rise again, knowing another storm will come, because this was the rhythm of life in Mesopotamia. Not calm, not gentle, but a relentless cycle of heat, dust, and endurance. If the daytime sun crushed your body, then the dust storms mocked your spirit. They whispered a reminder. Here, in this land between two rivers, survival was not a gift. It was a fight. Every breath, every sip of water, every moment in the open was borrowed, fragile, uncertain. And as you brush grit from your teeth, coughing the desert back into the air, you realize something. Even laughter here tastes like sand. And then, when the dust is settled and the sun finally slips beneath the horizon, you might think the worst is over. You might imagine that the night would bring relief, that coolness would soothe your skin after a day of merciless fire. But Mesopotamia was not so kind. The night carried its own cruelty, sharp and sudden, a chill that crept into your very bones. The first breath you take in the darkness surprises you. Only hours ago you were suffocating in the furnace of daylight, your chest heavy with burning air. Now the air cuts instead, cold, thin and biting. The ground beneath you, baked to stone by the sun, begins to release its stored heat. But once it is gone, the world turns harsh and unforgiving. There are no heaters, no blankets thick enough, no walls that seal out the night. The same clay bricks that trapped the day's fire now radiate emptiness, leaving you exposed to the desert's silent revenge. Without proper shelter, the cold is relentless. Your fingers stiffen, your teeth chatter, and every joint complains as if rusted by frost. The tunic that shielded you from burning rays now feels useless, flimsy, mocking. You curl against yourself, pressing arms across your chest, huddling in corners searching for scraps of warmth. And still the night slips inside you, quiet and merciless. Animals stir in the distance, restless under the stars. dogs bark at shadows. The wind carries whispers of movement, perhaps jackals, perhaps worse. Sleep becomes dangerous, and yet exhaustion begs for it. You close your eyes only to be startled awake by shivers so sharp they feel like knives. You wonder if dawn will ever come, if the sun will rise again, if your body can endure the pendulum swing between fire and ice. And yet, somehow people did endure. They built fires when they could, gathering reeds and branches, huddling close to one another, sharing breath, sharing heat. Families wrapped themselves in woven mats, children buried between parents, all clinging to the promise of another morning. In villages and cities alike, the rhythm was the same. Endure the blaze of day, then survive the chill of night, and pray to the gods that your fragile body did not falter between the two. There is a strange cruelty in such extremes. By day your skin burns, by night it freezes. There is no balance, no mercy, only the cycle of torment that defines life in this land between rivers. And you begin to understand, in the quiet hours beneath the stars, why Mesopotamians feared their gods so deeply. For in such a place, survival itself felt like divine judgment, a daily trial of body and spirit. As you lie awake, watching your own breath rise like mist in the pale moonlight, you almost laugh at the absurdity of it all. Only hours ago you begged the heavens for shade, for coolness, for escape from the fire. Now you curse the chill, begging for warmth, longing for even a trace of the sun's cruel embrace. It is a cycle designed to break you, and if you feel broken, that is because you are meant to. This is Mesopotamia, where the day scorches, the night freezes, and the fragile human body dangles in between, desperate, trembling, and small. You might think, after surviving the sun, the dust, and the freezing nights, that at least a sip of water would bring you comfort. But in ancient Mesopotamia, even that most basic need turned against you. The water you craved, the very thing your body begged for after hours of heat, was often the quietest enemy of all. The rivers looked beautiful from a distance, broad ribbons of life winding through the land, reflecting the sky in shades of bronze and silver. They gave Mesopotamia its name, the land between the rivers. But step closer, lower your jug, and the illusion crumbles. The water is not clear, it is cloudy, heavy with silt, buzzing with unseen dangers. A single sip carries not refreshment, but risk. You raise the clay cup to your lips, hoping for relief, and instead swallow sickness. The taste is earthy, metallic, and strangely bitter, but it is what you have. Hours later your stomach twists, cramping with a vengeance. Sweat beads on your skin, not from heat this time, but from fever. Your body shakes, your mouth dries again, and you realize the cruel irony. The more you drink, the sicker you become. It is not just you. Entire families are struck, sometimes whole streets. Children grow weak, their laughter fading to shallow breaths. Farmers collapse in fields, bellies clenched with pain. Disease flows as easily as the rivers themselves, carried from one mouth to the next, an invisible tide sweeping through the city. And no one truly understands why. To them, it is the will of angry gods, punishment for forgotten offerings, or perhaps the curse of neighbours in rival temples. But you, standing here in this ancient world, you can see what they could not. The canals that bring water to fields are the same ones that carry waste away from homes. Livestock wade in streams, their bodies fouling what people later drink. Clay jars sit open, gathering dust, insects, and rot. Hygiene, as you know it, does not exist here. The line between drinking water and poison is so thin it may as well not be there at all. The body grows weaker each day and still you cannot avoid it. Without water you will die in the punishing heat. With water you may die slowly, in fever and pain. There is no winning. It is survival by gamble, each sip a roll of the dice. Some are lucky, many are not. And perhaps, in the stillness of the night, as you curl on a mat stomach knotted, you even find the humour in it, the bitter humour of a cruel world. Here lies another Mesopotamian, you whisper to yourself, not slain by sword or lion, but by a drink of water. The thought makes you smile weakly, even as your body shivers, because in this land, even laughter tastes of dust, fever, and irony. This was Mesopotamia, where thirst could not be quenched, where rivers promised life but often delivered death, and where even the simplest act of drinking was a dangerous leap of faith. If bad water was not enough, then the sickness that followed it was far worse. In Mesopotamia, disease never crept alone. It surged like a flood, unstoppable, devouring homes, markets, and temples with terrifying speed. You might think of illness as something personal, a quiet battle within your body. But here, it was never private. When one person coughed, 10 more would soon follow. When a child grew feverish, half the street burned with the same fire by morning. The cities, for all their wonders, were perfect breeding grounds for plagues. Houses were packed tight, walls pressed close, courtyards shared, waste collected in corners, animals roamed freely, and clean air was a fantasy. One spark of sickness was enough to ignite the entire settlement. You could see it in the markets first. A vendor leaning on his stall, too weak to call out, a woman holding her head, her basket forgotten, whispers of fever spreading faster than the goods themselves. Soon the temples filled, not with worshippers seeking the gods in joy, but with the sick carried in desperation. Priests muttered prayers, burned incense, and offered sacrifices, but the coughs drowned the chants. The cries of pain outlasted the hymns, and as bodies grew cold, they were taken away quickly, buried in shallow graves outside the walls, the earth covering them hurriedly, almost nervously, as though speed could stop contagion. You can almost hear it now, the chorus of misery, the hacking coughs, the moans of fever, the desperate prayers of parents over limp children. Disease stripped the city of its rhythm. Work stopped. Trade slowed. Soldiers weakened. Life itself seemed to stumble, gasping, choking, staggering under the weight of the invisible chains, and still no one truly knew why. To them, these plagues were divine wrath, punishments rained down by gods displeased with offerings or forgotten rituals. A drought here, a flood there, and always, the people whispered, the gods are angry. There was no talk of germs, of infection, of what we now call bacteria, only mystery and fear. The speed of it was terrifying. 1 week, laughter in the streets, the next silence broken only by weeping. An entire household could vanish in days. A single soldier falling ill could doom his entire unit. And sometimes, whole quarters of a city grew hollow, door after door shut tight, not in safety but in mourning. And you, trapped in this ancient nightmare, would feel it too. That creeping paranoia, the awareness that every cough you hear, every bead of sweat on your skin, could mean the beginning of your own end. You drink, you eat, you breathe, and with each act comes suspicion. Was that bread touched by sick hands? Was that jug filled from a cursed canal? Did that passerby's breath carry more than words? It was a world where plagues did not just spread. They hunted, and you, standing in Mesopotamia, were always prey. If the rivers carried sickness, and the plagues spread like wildfire, then much of the blame lay in the filth that surrounded daily life. Ancient Mesopotamian, cities were marvels of human ingenuity, ziggurats rising toward the heavens, walls protecting vast communities, but beneath that grandeur lay an ugliness, an unavoidable truth. Waste was everywhere. There were no underground sewage systems as you know them, no neat pipes carrying refuse far away. Instead, there were narrow drains carved in streets, shallow channels that overflowed after rain, spilling their contents into alleys and courtyards. Human waste mixed with animal droppings, rotting food scraps, and stagnant puddles. Flies buzzed in swarms, a constant whining chorus that never ended. You could not walk a single street without stepping into something foul, without smelling the bitter stench that clung to every corner. Inside homes, the problem was no better. People used simple clay pots or dug pits, emptied when they overflowed, often tossed directly into the nearest canal. Imagine the water you drink being the very same place your waste returns to. An endless, vicious circle. The thought alone is enough to sour your stomach. And yet, this was life, unavoidable and daily. Children played in the alleys, barefoot, their laughter echoing between mud-brick walls, and yet every step carried danger. A scrape, a cut, a careless fall into the grime could mean infection, fever, or worse. Rats scurried freely, thriving in the scraps, spreading fleas, gnawing at whatever they found. To you, it is a nightmare. To them, it was simply normal. The smell lingered most at night, when the winds stilled and the air grew heavy. You would try to sleep, but the stench clung to your nostrils, sour and sharp, reminding you that you were never far from filth. And with it came fear. For every foul corner, every heap of refuse was not just unpleasant, it was deadly. Germs, though unknown to them, were kings in these streets. The waste was their throne, their palace, their weapon. Priests might blame the gods for outbreaks, neighbours might blame each other, but the truth was simpler. The cities themselves were breeding sickness in every crack and gutter, and you, unlucky enough to walk those streets, would carry it home with every step. Dust on your sandals, grime on your hands, unseen killers waiting for the chance to strike. It is almost laughable, isn't it? People could build towering temples, carve laws into stone, chart the stars with impressive accuracy, and yet, when it came to the simple act of cleanliness, they lived surrounded by their own undoing. Civilization in its glory and filth in its shadow. So when you imagine life in Mesopotamia, do not picture only the brilliance of kings and scribes. Picture also the gutters, the buzzing flies, the reek of stagnant canals. Because it was here, in the waste of daily life, that death waited patiently, quietly, certain that sooner or later you would stumble into its reach. By now you've endured the heat, the dust, the sickness and the filth. You might imagine that the greatest enemy in Mesopotamia was nature itself. But no, sometimes the most dangerous force was human law, carved into stone, sharp as the chisel that etched it. The Code of Hammurabi. It stood tall in the city, carved into black basalt, each line a command from the king, each punishment clear, absolute, and merciless. To look upon it was to feel small, to feel the weight of justice that cared little for mercy. And at the heart of it all was a principle both simple and terrifying. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Imagine it. A man strikes another, blinding him in one eye. There is no fine, no apology, no trial filled with endless debate. Number. The punishment is swift and certain. The offender is brought forward, held steady, and his own eye is taken. The law does not ask whether he is sorry. It does not ask whether the act was born of anger, of mistake, or of despair. Justice here is not about balance of hearts, but balance of flesh. You harm, you are harmed. You take, you are taken from. The people live with this knowledge woven into every gesture, every decision. A careless hand, a reckless word, a sudden strike, all of it can bring punishment that mirrors the deed exactly. It is meant to deter, yes, but it also instills fear. You walk the streets knowing that one wrong move could cost you dearly, that the law is not a shield but a blade hanging overhead. And the brutality is not confined to eyes and teeth. If a builder's house collapses and kills its owner, the builder is put to death. If it kills the owner's son, the builder's son is killed in his place. The law stretches beyond the individual, punishing families, blood for blood, life for life. Justice here is collective, echoing through households, tearing into lives that may have had nothing to do with the crime at all. It sounds harsh, and it was harsh. Yet, in its way, it offered a kind of certainty. No one could claim ignorance. The laws were written, displayed, spoken aloud by priests and scribes. Everyone knew. There were no hidden courts, no secret bargains behind closed doors. The king declared the rules, and the rules were absolute. Brutal, yes. Unforgiving, certainly, but clear. Now imagine yourself living under this system. You bump into a merchant's stall and clay jars tumble, breaking on the street. Was it an accident? The law might not care. The merchant cries foul, and already eyes turn toward you, measuring, weighing. You feel the stone weight of Hammurabi's code pressing on your shoulders, reminding you that fairness here is sharp, literal, and often merciless. And yet, amid the fear, some found comfort in it. After all, in a world filled with floods, famines, and plagues, at least here was something predictable. If someone harmed you, the law promised balance. If you were cheated, the code demanded repayment. There was justice, even if it was carved, with a knife instead of written with compassion. Still, as you lie awake at night, listening to the quiet murmur of the city, you can't help but wonder, how many lived with missing eyes, Missing hands, missing hope, all in the name of justice. How many lives were broken not by lions or storms, but by the cold, unwavering words of stone? In Mesopotamia, survival was not just about withstanding the sun or the rivers. It was about living under laws that bound you as tightly as chains, where justice was measured in wounds and mercy was as rare as rain. If the law of an eye for an eye seemed heavy, then wait until you learn how little it sometimes took to invite ruin. In Mesopotamia, even the smallest crime could carry consequences so severe they would leave you trembling before ever daring to step out of line again. The Code of Hammurabi was not designed for forgiveness. It was designed for order, for control, for fear. And so, what might be today considered a petty mistake, a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness, was met with punishments that felt enormous, crushing, final. Take theft, for example. A loaf of bread snatched in hunger might mean death. Yes, death. Not a fine, not a stern warning, not even lashes to remind you of your crime. Simply the end. To steal from a temple or a palace was to risk execution, your body a warning to others who might be tempted to follow. And even stealing from an ordinary citizen could strip you of your life or your freedom, because the law valued property almost as much as it valued blood. False accusations carried weight as well. If you accused another without proof, without evidence carved in witness or stone, the law turned back upon you. If the accused was condemned to death and later proven innocent, then the accuser took their place. Lies, careless words, or even misunderstandings could twist into a noose around your own neck. Contracts too were sacred. To break an agreement, to default on a loan, to mismeasure grain or cheat with a scale, these were not minor slips. They were crimes that could see you stripped of land, forced into servitude, or beaten until your flesh remembered what your memory might soon forget. A misweighed basket of barley could cost you more than a market quarrel. It could cost you your livelihood, your status, perhaps even your life. Now imagine yourself wandering through a bustling Mesopotamian market. The air is thick with spices, the shouting of vendors, the clatter of pottery and grain. You hesitate before a stall, your stomach empty, your hand itching toward a fig. Just one, you think. No one will notice. But the code is watching. The law is listening. And should you give in to temptation, you may find yourself dragged through the streets, judged not as hungry but as criminal, punished not with sympathy but with iron. The harshness of these penalties shaped how people lived. Fear kept order. Fear kept hands away from goods that did not belong to them. Fear ensured that contracts were honoured, debts repaid, oaths upheld. It was brutal, yes, but effective. The king did not care if the punishment seemed disproportionate to the crime. What mattered was obedience, control, the smooth running of the city under his watchful eye. But it also meant that mercy was rare, that mistakes, honest or not, could destroy lives. A child pocketing something out of curiosity, a debtor falling ill and unable to pay, a worker spilling goods by accident, all could find themselves facing penalties that today would seem monstrous. And yet, in this world, you had no choice. You learned quickly to weigh your every action, your every word, because the punishment for a small crime was never small. The stones of the code did not bend, and the king's justice did not soften. So, when you picture Mesopotamia, do not only see the glory of its temples or the wisdom of its scribes, see also the trembling hands in the marketplace, the fearful glances of debtors, the silence of neighbours too afraid to speak. Because here, survival meant not just living through heat and hunger, it meant walking a narrow path where one misstep could end everything. If the laws of Hammurabi were harsh for merchants, builders or landowners, then for slaves and commoners they were merciless. The code was not blind. It did not weigh every life equally. Instead, it carved society into ranks, and at the bottom stood those whose suffering carried little weight in the eyes of the law. A noble might strike another noble and pay in equal flesh. But if a noble struck a commoner, the punishment was lighter, often reduced to a fine, and if the victim was a slave, then the injury was measured not in pain but in silver, the price of a broken bone, the value of an eye, the worth of a life reduced to coin. Imagine living with the knowledge that your body was not truly yours, but a possession to be compensated for like a damaged cart or a lost goat. For slaves, punishment was constant, a shadow that followed with every step. If a slave raised a hand against a master, death waited swiftly. If they attempted to escape, their fate was even more brutal: branding, mutilation, execution. The code did not seek to reform them, did not imagine freedom or fairness. It demanded obedience, silence, and fear. Commoners fared little better. A debt unpaid could mean being sold into slavery, not just for you but for your family as well. One season of poor harvest, one illness that kept you from working, and suddenly your children might be sold as payment, their futures stolen because the law valued debt more than dignity. The poor lived with this terror daily, always aware that survival was a fragile thread easily cut by hunger, misfortune, or a creditor's claim. Picture yourself in this world, standing in the market. A nobleman's servant shoves past you, spilling your basket of barley. You protest, your voice shaking with anger, but already eyes are on you, warning you, silently. Do not raise your tone, do not push back, for the law is not on your side. Your word carries less weight, your pain less value. To challenge the higher ranks is to court disaster, and so you bite your tongue, gather your spilled grain, and swallow your fury. And yet, despite the cruelty, this system held the city together. The nobles ruled, the commoners laboured, the slaves obeyed. The machine of civilization turned smoothly, powered by inequality. The king's laws promised order, but it was order built upon fear, upon the bones of those with no voice. At night, when the streets grew quiet and the fires dimmed, you could almost hear the whisper of this imbalance. The heavy silence of commoners who dared not complain, the restless dreams of slaves who longed for freedom but woke to chains, and the smug certainty of nobles who knew that the stone laws protected them more than anyone else. It is tempting, perhaps, to imagine rebellion, to dream of justice reshaped. But in Hammurabi's Mesopotamia, rebellion was death, and justice was already carved in stone. The poor endured, the slaves endured, not because they chose to, but because the law left them no other path. So when you think of Mesopotamia's greatness, its kings, its temples, its vast canals, do not forget those who carried its weight. The slaves with scarred backs, the commoners who lived one debt away from ruin, the silent majority for whom the code offered no mercy, only chains. Because here, justice was not blind. It looked directly at who you were, and decided your worth before you ever spoke. If Mesopotamia was the cradle of civilization, it was also a cradle rocked by endless conflict. Kingdoms rose and fell like waves, each one desperate to outshine the last, each king hungering not only for survival, but for dominance. And their rivalries, bitter, ruthless, and unrelenting, shaped the fate of every ordinary soul caught between them. Picture the land as a patchwork of city-states, each with its own ruler seated on a throne of clay and pride. Babylon, Lagash, Akkad. Names carved deep into history, but to their neighbours they were threats waiting to strike. The kings spoke of glory, of the gods' favour, of destiny written in the stars, but beneath their words lay simple truths: power, wealth, and fear. When one king dug a canal to feed his fields, another accused him of stealing water. When one king raised a temple higher, another claimed the gods were insulted. Even small slights could ignite bloodshed. Armies gathered, chariots rattled, and the ordinary farmer who only wanted to sow barley found himself drafted, spear in hand, fighting a war he neither started nor understood. The rivalries were personal as well as political. Hammurabi of Babylon, sharp and cunning, fought not only to expand his land but to prove himself greater than those who came before. His enemies, rulers of Lhasa, Mari and beyond, saw him as a threat to their thrones. So while priests prayed for peace, kings sharpened daggers behind closed walls. The land itself became a chessboard, every city a piece to be captured or crushed. And for the people, there was no escape. You could swear loyalty to your city's king, but tomorrow the banners might change. One day you paid taxes to one ruler, the next to another who claimed your land as his prize. Refusal was not an option. A farmer who failed to deliver grain, a craftsman who resisted conscription, a villager who hesitated to bow, all faced punishments as harsh as defeat itself. Imagine the tension in the air, rumours rushing like dust storms. The king of is marching north. Babylon gathers allies. The gods favour Akkad. Every whisper tightened throats. Every horn in the distance made hands tremble. You never knew if tomorrow would bring peace or fire. For the kings, these rivalries were games of pride and ambition. For you, they were nightmares. Cities burned not because the gods demanded it, but because kings envied each other's power. Children starved not because the rivers failed, but because armies trampled the fields. And still, each ruler declared himself chosen, righteous, destined. At night, you would hear the silence between battles, the fragile calm before another storm. Kings slept under golden canopies, plotting their next moves, but you, an ordinary soul, slept with fear as your blanket, knowing that one man's pride could become your city's ruin. It is easy to admire Mesopotamia's kings, their conquests, their monuments. But remember, their rivalries were not only carved into stone, they were carved into the bodies of the people, into the ashes of homes, into the endless cycle of war that made peace feel like a dream. In Mesopotamia, survival was never just about the land or the river. It was about kings who could not stand to see each other rise, rulers who fought their battles with your life as the wager. And you, caught in the middle, learned quickly that the rivalry of kings was the greatest storm of all. If the rivalries of kings were storms on the horizon, then the burning of villages was the lightning that struck without warning. For while rulers quarrelled over temples, canals and borders, it was the ordinary settlements, small clusters of mud brick homes, families tending goats and barley, that paid the highest price. Armies did not march politely past villages, they consumed them. To feed soldiers, grain was taken. To weaken enemies, wells were poisoned. To prove dominance, roofs were set aflame. Villages became bargaining chips, sacrifices tossed into the fire of ambition. And those who lived in them, farmers, herders, children, were swallowed by chaos. Picture it. Dawn breaking quietly, roosters calling, smoke curling from simple ovens where bread baked. Then, the distant thunder of hooves. At first, you might mistake it for a storm. But no, it grows louder, harsher, warriors shouting, chariots rattling. By the time you realise what it is, it's already too late. Spears glint in the sun, and fire follows them like a second army. Homes carefully built from clay and reed crumble quickly under flame. Roofs collapse, walls buckle, smoke chokes the air. Families flee, clutching children, dragging bundles of whatever they can carry. But where can they run? The fields are open, the roads filled with soldiers, the rivers too far, and so many are caught, some killed outright, others taken as slaves, their lives torn from them in moments. Looting was as common as fire. Soldiers stormed through homes, tearing valuables from shelves, stripping people of clothes, seizing livestock. Even temples were not always spared. Statues of gods, vessels of silver, offerings carefully laid by villagers, all were stolen, carried back as proof of victory. To the conquerors it was wealth. To the people it was desecration. And yet this was no rare tragedy. It happened again and again, each raid repeating the same cruel script. One year you rebuilt your house, patched your roof, replanted your field. The next year another army came, another fire consumed it, another season was lost. Survival became not about thriving, but about rebuilding, endlessly, hopelessly, with no guarantee of safety. Imagine yourself among them. Your home gone, your neighbours scattered, the fields black with ash. You taste smoke in your mouth, feel grit under your nails as you dig for anything left unburned. Perhaps a pot, perhaps a tool, perhaps nothing at all. And in the silence that follows, you know only this. You must rebuild. Because what else is there? Yet deep inside, you fear the truth. Even if you rebuild, even if you plant again, the soldiers will come again. This cycle of destruction was the rhythm of Mesopotamian life, tied not to seasons of rain or harvest, but to seasons of war. Kings might boast of victories, carve their triumphs into stone stele, proclaim themselves chosen by the gods, but behind every victory was a village in ruins, its people broken, its ashes still warm. So when you picture Mesopotamia's greatness, do not see only the glitter of Babylon's walls or the majesty of ziggurats. See also the blackened ruins of villages, the smoke rising into empty skies, the silence of fields that should have sung with life. Because here, in this ancient land, war did not only shape borders, it burned homes, stole futures, and left scars too deep for stone to record. The rivalries of kings, the conscription of soldiers, the burning of villages, all of it might sound like the great movements of history. But history was not only written on stone stelae or sung in royal hymns, it was carved painfully into the lives of ordinary people, and it was they, farmers, potters, herders, children, who bore the heaviest burden of Mesopotamia's endless wars. Ordinary people did not choose conflict. They wanted barley to grow, sheep to fatten, children to laugh in the courtyards. Yet conflict chose them, again and again, pulling them into battles they never asked for. A farmer might wake to find his field trampled by marching soldiers. His grain, meant to feed his family through winter, seized to supply an army. His ox, his plough, his tools, all taken. Left behind was only dust, a patch of land scarred by footprints and wheel tracks, where nothing remained to sustain him. A potter might see his workshop shattered, clay jars crushed under boots, kiln overturned. A herder might return to find his flock stolen, his livelihood walking away under the control of armed men. And what could they do? Nothing. To resist was death. To complain was foolishness. To endure was the only choice. Families fractured under the weight of conflict. Men pressed into service vanished for months, sometimes forever, their names remembered only in whispered prayers. Women carried the burden of fields and homes alone, waiting for husbands, brothers, sons who might never return. Children learned too early that games were replaced by work, laughter by fear. Their lullabies were not songs of peace, but the distant echo of horns and the crackle of fire. Even in times of so-called peace, the fear lingered. You might rebuild your home, sow your seeds, barter in the market, but always you watched the horizon, listening for rumours, glancing at strangers with suspicion. Peace was never permanent. It was only the space between wars, a fragile pause before the next storm. The kings boasted of their victories. They inscribed their conquests, carved their triumphs, erected monuments to themselves. But nowhere on those stones did they carve the hunger of children, the despair of widows, the silence of villages turned to ash. The history of ordinary people was not written. It was lived, painfully, day by day, in shadows cast by decisions made in palaces far away. Now imagine yourself among them. You're not a king. You're not a soldier with a chariot. You're a weaver, hands raw from work, heart heavy from worry. You hear the rumours of armies moving, of kings arguing, of gods invoked for war. You know what is coming, and you know there is no choice, no escape. You will pay the price, whether in labour, in grain, in blood, or in silence. This was the reality of Mesopotamia. Survival was never simply about enduring the river's floods or the sun's heat. It was about surviving the ambitions of kings, the greed of soldiers, the fire of war. And for ordinary people, conflict was not a story of glory. It was a shadow that fell over every field, every street, every cradle. So when you imagine Mesopotamia, do not see only its towering ziggurats and gleaming walls. See also the bent backs of farmers, the tired eyes of mothers, the frightened steps of children. Because it was they, the ordinary people, who lived through conflict, who endured it, who carried its weight, and who were forgotten by the very kings who caused it. If the wars did not break you, and the laws did not crush you, then the land itself would test you. In Mesopotamia, the fields were both a blessing and a curse. The rivers gave life, but the soil demanded sweat, and so much of life here was defined by endless toil under the burning sun. From dawn to dusk, the farmer's rhythm never stopped. The day began before the sky even blushed with light. A man rose stiff-backed from his reed mat, washed his face in a clay basin, and stepped into the fields while the air was still cool. But the coolness never lasted. Soon the sun rose higher, merciless, turning the fields into a furnace. The earth baked hard, the air shimmered, and every breath tasted of dust. Work was constant, heavy, and punishing. With wooden ploughs tied to oxen, farmers carved furrows into stubborn soil. They scattered seeds of barley and wheat with calloused hands, praying the rivers would flood just enough, not too much, not too little. Then came irrigation. Endless hours digging canals, patching embankments, hauling water with jars. The very gift of the Tigris and Euphrates was no simple gift. It was a taskmaster that demanded attention, labour, vigilance. A moment's neglect and crops would wither or wash away. The body bore the cost of this toil. Backs bent until they ached, shoulders hardened like stone, Skin burned, blistered, peeled under the relentless heat. Blisters cracked into sores, hands thick with calluses, every muscle ached from labour. And still, the work never truly ended. By the time one task was complete, another waited. Sowing led to weeding, weeding to harvesting, harvesting to threshing, threshing to storing. A farmer's year was a circle without rest, nor was it secure. A flood too strong could drown fields, a drought too long could starve them, a swarm of locusts could turn green abundance into bare stalks overnight. And so, despite all the labour, the farmer lived in constant uncertainty, caught between nature's whims and the king's demands for grain. Picture yourself in his place, sweat dripping into your eyes, hands raw from the plough, the sun stabbing down with no mercy. You glance at your neighbour, who works just as hard, and at your children waiting in the shade of a mud brick wall. You know their survival depends on your strength, your endurance. If you falter, if you pause, if you collapse in the field, hunger will come for them first. And yet, there is no reward beyond survival. The grain you harvest is not fully yours. Taxes claim their share. Temples claim their offerings. The king claims his due for soldiers and wars. What remains must stretch through the year, thin porridge on lean days, bread that is more dust than flour when times grow hard. It is almost cruel, isn't it? The land was fertile, yes, but fertile like a cruel master, giving only to those who bent, sweated, and bled for it. Civilization was built on these backs, on men and women who worked until their bodies broke, who endured. The endless toil of the fields under the unblinking sun. So when you think of Mesopotamia's glory, its kings, its temples, its writing on clay tablets, remember also this: behind every brick of a ziggurat was the calloused hand of a farmer. Behind every feast in a palace was a field worked until exhaustion. And beneath the beauty of civilization lay the endless labour of those who had no choice but to toil, day after day, beneath a sun that showed no mercy. Even if the farmer survived the blazing sun, even if the floods were tamed and the harvest was good, there was still another enemy waiting at the gates: the rulers themselves. Kings, priests, tax collectors, they all stretched out their hands, and those hands never left the fields empty. You might think a farmer's harvest belonged to him, to his family, to the children who waited for bread at home. But in Mesopotamia, much of that harvest was claimed long before the first grain touched the family's table. The rulers demanded their share, and their share was never small. From the temples came priests declaring that the gods required offerings: barley, wheat, dates, oil, all poured into the storehouses of the divine. But the gods did not eat. The priests did, and the temples grew rich while the farmers grew thin. From the palaces came officials, scribes with clay tablets, recording bushels and baskets, measuring the sweat of the poor as numbers on wet clay. They did not bend their backs in the fields. They did not bleed under the sun, yet their demands cut as sharply as any blade. One missing basket of grain, one unpaid measure of barley, and punishment fell quickly, whether in fines, forced labour, or confiscation of land. The unfairness was bitter. Imagine standing in your storage room, jars lined neatly, sacks piled against the wall, and watching officials carry them away one by one. Your children's food taken, your winter's safety gone, and you, powerless, forced to bow your head as the king's servants marched off with your livelihood. What remained was often meagre, barely enough to feed a family until the next harvest. Bread grew thin, portions small, bellies hollow. A bad year meant starvation, not because the land gave nothing, but because the rulers took too much. Famine could walk hand in hand with abundance, depending not on nature, but on the greed of those in power. And the cruelty did not end with grain. Taxes came in every form: fish from the river, wool from sheep, oil from pressed sesame. Even labour itself was taxed. A farmer could be summoned to dig canals, build walls, or haul stones for temples, his hands forced away from his own field just when his crops needed him most. And while he worked for king and god, his family waited, hungry, praying he would return with enough strength left to keep them alive. Picture yourself in this trap. You rise before dawn, sweat until your skin burns, harvest with shaking hands, and at the end of the season you stand with almost nothing. Your labour fills other mouths, your grain feeds other tables, Your strength builds monuments that will never bear your name, and still the rulers demand more, as though your exhaustion were invisible, as though your hunger did not matter. Civilization, they said, required sacrifice, and indeed it did. But the sacrifice was never equal. The kings feasted while farmers scraped at the bottom of jars. Temples glittered with offerings while homes echoed with emptiness. The glory of Mesopotamia rose high on the backs of its people, and the people themselves were left bent, weary, and hungry. So, when you look at the splendour of Babylon, the beauty of Ur, the towering ziggurats that kissed the sky, remember this: every stone, every feast, every storehouse of grain was paid for by farmers who gave more than they could afford. Civilization was not built on fairness. It was built on the unfair share of crops taken by rulers, leaving ordinary men and women to live on crumbs while kings dined like gods. Day after day, year after year, the body could not escape the price of Mesopotamian labour. Farming, hauling, building, digging, these were not tasks for the faint of heart, nor for the fragile. And yet ordinary people had no choice but to endure them, because survival meant submission to the fields, to the canals, to the demands of kings and gods. The body broke slowly, like a reed bent under too much weight. A farmer's back curved from endless bending, his joints stiff and swollen from lifting stones and dragging ploughs. Calluses thickened until hands looked more like leather than flesh. Feet cracked from walking barefoot in the hot earth, and skin darkened, burned, and peeled beneath the sun's unblinking gaze. There was no word for rest day. There was only work, always work until strength gave out. Illness came easily to a weary body. Infections from cuts, fevers from exhaustion, lung sickness from dust, all took their toll. A man might collapse in the field and never rise again. A woman might waste away after too many seasons of carrying water, grinding grain, and bearing children without pause. And children, forced into work too young, grew into adults already half broken by the burdens placed upon them. Life expectancy was cruelly short. Most people never dreamed of growing old. To live beyond 40 was rare, a kind of fragile miracle. Death came early, whether from hunger, disease, or sheer exhaustion. The body could only serve so long before it faltered, and when it did, there were no doctors with real cures, no medicine beyond herbs and prayers. Often, the only answer was silence. And yet, the rulers did not care. To them, people were as replaceable as oxen. One man died, another took his place. A family lost a father, but the king lost only a worker, easily filled by another. Life was cheap in Mesopotamia, cheap for rulers, costly for the poor. Picture yourself again, standing in the field, shoulders heavy, vision blurred by sweat. You force yourself to push the plough one more step, though your body begs you to stop. You think of your children waiting for food, of the tax collector who will come regardless of your pain. You know that if you rest, you starve. If you stop, you die. And so you move forward, one painful step at a time, until the day your strength finally runs out, and when it does, the world will continue as if you were never there. The tragedy is that this cycle fed civilization itself. The grand cities, the shining temples, the proud walls of Mesopotamia, all stood because countless bodies gave their strength and their lives to build them. Exhaustion was the price of progress. Early death was the foundation of civilization, and those who bore that weight were never honoured, never remembered. So when you hear of Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization, pause for a moment. Behind the cradle was the grave. For every invention, every achievement, there were men and women whose bodies broke too soon, whose lives ended too early. Civilization was a glory to the few, but for the many it was a slow march toward exhaustion and an early grave. The rivers gave life, the fields gave food, but beyond the walls of Mesopotamian towns lurked a danger no farmer could plough away. Lions. Yes, real lions, tawny and powerful, moving like shadows through the reed thickets and dry plains. In a world without rifles, without steel fences, without even a torch bright enough to hold them back, lions were not distant creatures of story. They were neighbours, dangerous, hungry neighbours. At night, when the settlement quieted and the last clay lamps flickered low, the roar of lions sometimes rolled across the land, deep, thunderous, shaking in the chest. Imagine lying on your mat in the dark, your children pressed close, listening to that sound creeping closer. Each roar was not simply noise, it was a promise. The hunters were near. The walls of villages were little defence. Mud brick crumbled easily. Reed fences snapped like twigs beneath a lion's paw. A hungry lion could leap into an enclosure, scatter goats and sheep, and vanish into the night with a mouthful of livestock before anyone even stirred. For farmers who already gave too much to kings and gods, the loss of an animal could mean starvation. Sometimes the lions took more than livestock. Stories were whispered of children snatched while playing outside the safety of the village, of shepherds dragged from their flocks, of women attacked while gathering water at the river. These were not just myths. They were warnings, passed from mouth to mouth, grim reminders that the wild still claimed its share of human lives. Kings made great theatre of lion hunting. They carved themselves on stone walls, spears in hand, chariots charging, lions falling beneath their might. But those hunts were more show than struggle. Lions trapped in enclosures, weakened before the royal kill. For ordinary people, there was no pageantry. There was only fear. When a lion stalked your field, you had no spear, no chariot, no army of guards. You had only trembling hands and hope that tonight the beast would go elsewhere. Picture the scene. The moon low, the fields hushed, a sudden crash of hooves as animals scatter. Then silence. Then a scream, cut short. The lion moves quickly, muscles rippling, eyes glowing like fire in the dark. By the time the villagers gather with torches, the beast is gone, leaving only paw prints in the dust and a trail of blood leading into the reeds. It was a reminder again and again that Mesopotamia was never fully tamed. Civilization might rise in bricks and temples, but beyond its fragile borders, the wild pressed in, and lions were the sharpest edge of that wild. The people prayed to gods for protection, set fires at the edges of their settlements, carved charms to ward away predators. Yet still the lions came, driven by hunger, fearless of clay walls or human cries. For them, Mesopotamia's farms and villages were not sacred spaces, they were hunting grounds. So when you imagine Mesopotamia, do not see only kings standing proudly with spears in palace carvings. Imagine also the humble farmer clutching his child close, listening to the roar outside the walls. Imagine the shepherd, heart racing as shadows move in the reeds. Imagine the settlement trembling in silence, praying the lions will pass by this night. Because for ordinary people, survival was not only about hunger, flood, or war. It was also about teeth and claws waiting in the dark. If lions ruled the night and scorpions crept through the shadows, then snakes were the silent killers of Mesopotamia. They needed no roar, no stampede of hooves, no crashing entry into the village. A snake waited quietly, coiled beneath reeds, hidden under stones, or stretched across the warm dust of a pathway. One careless step, one unguarded hand reaching into a pile of grain, and the strike came, swift, sharp, and often fatal. Venomous snakes slithered freely across the river valleys, loving the same water channels that humans built for irrigation. The canals that carried life to fields also carried death in the form of fangs. Farmers digging ditches sometimes found their legs pierced without warning. Shepherds guiding flocks might hear the hiss, feel the bite, and know instantly that death was stalking them from the inside out. There was no cure, no anti-venom, no knowledge of how venom worked, no medicine strong enough to reverse it. A healer might chant incantations, press herbs to the wound, or trace protective symbols on clay. But more often than not, the body still weakened, the flesh swelled, and death crept in. It could take hours or days, slow agony marked by fever, paralysis, and breath that grew shallower until it stopped altogether. The terror lay not only in the pain, but in the helplessness. Imagine a child bitten while gathering reeds. The family rushes to the healer, hope clinging to them like a drowning man to driftwood. But the healer's hands tremble, and deep down everyone knows. The chants are old, the herbs are weak, the gods are silent. And slowly, before their eyes, the child slips away. Snakes did not care about the struggles of humans. They thrived in the same fertile lands, hiding among the crops, sunning themselves on warm mud brick walls. At night, they might slide into homes, attracted by warmth or the smell of stored grain. A single careless touch in the dark could turn sleep into horror. Kings and priests spoke often of lions, carving their triumphs into stone, but snakes rarely appeared in those boasts. Why? Because there was no triumph to claim. A lion could be hunted, a scorpion crushed, but a snake? It struck without warning, vanished into shadows, and left only suffering behind. Ordinary people faced it alone, armed with nothing more than fear and prayer. The presence of snakes shaped daily life in quiet, invisible ways. Children were warned never to walk barefoot in tall grass. Farmers prodded the earth with sticks before stepping forward. Travellers paused before every stone, every clump of reeds, scanning for movement. Life itself became a careful dance around a danger that could not be seen until it was too late. And always there was the shadow of death. Not the grand death of warriors, not the noble death of kings, but the silent, ignoble death of a farmer's misstep. Civilization might build ziggurats, carve laws into stone, invent writing itself, but none of those things could shield an ankle from fangs or stop venom from spreading through blood. Picture it clearly. You're walking back from the fields at dusk, tired, your body heavy with exhaustion. The path looks safe. You do not notice the pattern in the dust, the coil pressed flat, waiting. Then, in a flash, pain explodes in your leg. You stumble, clutching at the wound, but the world has already changed. You are marked, poisoned, your body no longer your own. And in Mesopotamia, that was often the beginning of the end. So, when we speak of Mesopotamia's dangers, let us not forget this quieter, crueler enemy. Death did not always come with the roar of a lion or the sting of a scorpion. Sometimes it came in silence, with a hiss, a strike, and a venom for which there was no cure. If lions prowled outside the walls and snakes slithered through fields, then scorpions brought danger into the very heart of Mesopotamian life. They were not beasts that roared or hissed. They were quiet, patient, and everywhere. In the cracks of mud brick walls, in the corners of storage rooms under sleeping mats, inside clay jars, scorpions hid where people least expected them. Small, yes, but no less feared. Their sting carried fire, pain that burned through the body with cruel intensity. For some, it was only agony that lingered for days. For others, especially children, the elderly, or the already weak, it could mean death. And in a world without cures, without soothing balms or true medicine, a scorpion's sting was more than a nuisance. It was a threat that shadowed every household. Imagine lifting the lid of a clay jar, reaching inside for grain, and feeling instead the stab of a stinger. Imagine lying down to rest, only to feel something crawling across your skin in the dark. The scream, the rush, the frantic attempts to find the creature in the lamplight. This was not a rare nightmare, but a familiar fear. Children learned caution early. They were taught to shake out mats before sleeping, to check sandals before wearing them, to tread carefully in the cool, shadowed corners where scorpions love to hide. Even so, accidents happened. And when they did, families turned to whatever help they could. Chants, herbs, poultices pressed against the wound. Yet the swelling, the fever, the sharp, stabbing pain often laughed at such remedies. Sometimes the only thing left was prayer. Scorpions did not discriminate. They crawled into the huts of farmers as easily as the halls of nobles. Even kings could not fully escape their presence. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia speak of them, etched warnings, that reveal how deeply these creatures haunted the imagination. They were not just pests. They were symbols of lurking danger, of the hidden threats that civilization could never fully conquer. Picture a settlement at dusk. Families gather for their evening meal, the smell of bread heavy in the air. Lamps glow, shadows stretch across walls, and in those shadows, unseen, a scorpion waits, unmoving, its stinger curved like a weapon. It does not roar, it does not strike until disturbed, but when it does, the pain it leaves behind is unforgettable, a reminder that even in the safety of home, danger could be only a hand's breadth away. The cruelest part was the ordinariness of it. Lions were rare, snakes less so, but scorpions were constant. They were woven into daily life, accepted like dust, like heat, like hunger. People learned to live with them, never at ease, always watchful. Civilization advanced, temples rose, writing spread across clay tablets, but the scorpions remained, tucked into the corners, a quiet, enduring enemy. And so, survival in Mesopotamia was not just about withstanding wars, enduring famine, or surviving floods. It was also about vigilance in the smallest details, shaking your blanket, checking your sandals, sweeping the corners before nightfall. Because sometimes the difference between life and death was not a great battle or a royal decree. Sometimes it was a stinger waiting in the shadows of your own home. So, when you imagine Mesopotamia, do not see only ziggurats rising toward the heavens. Picture also a simple clay house, its family huddled inside, lamps burning low, and the silent fear of what might crawl from the shadows before morning. Because in this land, even the smallest creatures carried the weight of death in their tails. When sickness came in Mesopotamia, people did not look first to medicine in the way we think of it today. They looked to the unseen, to whispers of spirits, and the favour, or wrath, of the gods. Illness was rarely seen as the simple breaking of the body. Instead, it was thought to be punishment, possession, or the touch of dark forces, and so healing was bound tightly to superstition and magic. A sick man might not call for a doctor, but for an ashipu, a healer priest, trained not in herbs and anatomy, but in incantations and rituals. The ashipu would arrive with a basket of charms, clay figurines and tablets etched with spells. He would set them near the bed, muttering words meant to drive out the sickness as if it were a demon hiding in the man's chest. Smoke might be waved through the air, bitter herbs burned not for their medicinal effect, but to cleanse the spirit of unseen corruption. Sometimes the cure involved transferring illness into another object. A figurine of clay might be pressed against the patient's skin, absorbing the sickness, then smashed or buried to carry the affliction away. Water was poured over charms and then drunk, as if the power of words could seep into the bloodstream and drive out fever. Amulets, tied around the neck, promised protection, not through medicine, but through divine magic. And always, the patient lay waiting, groaning in fever, hoping these rituals would work. Sometimes they did seem to help, perhaps because of rest, perhaps because the body healed itself, but just as often the fever burned hotter, the cough grew deeper, and the family's hope faded. Still, they clung to ritual, for what else could they do? The line between healer and magician was thin. A ritual might involve the slaughter of a lamb, its liver read like a message from the gods, guiding treatment. If the liver showed spots or strange shapes, it was said the illness would not leave. If it was clean, the family took comfort that the gods had given permission for healing. In this way, the body's fate rested not in medicine, but in omens and symbols. Picture yourself sick in this world, shivering with fever, chest rattling, unable to breathe. Instead of cool water and medicine, you feel the rough press of a clay charm against your forehead. You hear chants rising in a steady, low rhythm, words you do not fully understand. Smoke stings your eyes. The healer tells you the demon is weakening, that soon it will depart. And perhaps you believe, because belief is the only medicine you have. But the truth was harsher. Many died under these rituals. Many never rose from the mats where they lay, and their families could do nothing but mourn, convinced that some unseen spirit had claimed them, not knowing it was the limits of knowledge that had doomed them. Yet there is something strangely human in this reliance on superstition. It shows how desperately people sought meaning, comfort, and hope in a world they could not control. They feared sickness as something bigger than themselves, and so they fought it with the only weapons they had: words, charms, fire, and faith. So, when you think of Mesopotamia, do not picture doctors in white robes with clean instruments. Picture instead a darkened room, a clay lamp flickering, a priest chanting softly, and a family gathered close, their eyes full of fear and fragile hope. Healing was not in science, it was in superstition and magic. And for the sick, that was often the only chance they had. When superstition and magic failed, people of Mesopotamia turned to the earth itself. The land that gave them wheat, dates, and barley also offered plants that seemed to hold healing powers. Leaves, roots, and seeds were crushed, boiled, or chewed in hope that they might soothe pain or drive away illness. And sometimes they did, but often they did very little, leaving the sick to linger in misery. Healers knew of herbs like willow bark, whose bitter taste could dull a fever, or juniper, burned in smoke to cleanse the air. They pressed garlic into wounds, believing its sharp sting carried power. They mixed crushed seeds with honey, smeared poultices across swollen flesh, and brewed bitter teas to calm the stomach. These remedies were drawn from careful observation, from centuries of trial and error passed down by word of mouth, then scratched onto clay tablets by scribes. But the truth was simple. Most remedies could only ease, not cure. A man with a cough might drink a bitter tea and feel his throat soothed for a moment, but the sickness remained, hidden deep in his lungs. A child with fever might be rubbed with oils, wrapped in herbs, yet the heat of illness would burn on until life itself flickered out. For wounds, herbs might clean or numb, but infection often followed, spreading silently until the body weakened beyond recovery. Picture a healer crouched beside a patient, carefully grinding roots with a stone, mixing powders with honey. The smell is sharp, earthy, bitter. The patient swallows, grimacing at the taste, while family members watch with anxious eyes. For a while, there is hope. Perhaps this time the herbs will work. Perhaps this time the sickness will break. And when the patient groans again in pain, the hope collapses, but the family still asks for more, because hope, even thin hope, was better than nothing. The effectiveness of these remedies depended heavily on luck. Some plants carried mild relief, others carried danger. A dose too strong could poison as surely as it healed. Without true knowledge of the body, healers worked in shadows, experimenting on the desperate, learning slowly, painfully, often too late. And yet people trusted herbs. They were tangible, real, unlike invisible chants and rituals. To drink a bitter tea, to press leaves against a wound, to smell smoke rising from burning seeds. It felt like action, like resistance against the helplessness of illness. Even if the relief was small, it was something to cling to in a world where so little could be controlled. But imagine the disappointment. Fever breaking not because of herbs, but because the body fought alone. Wounds healing not because of leaves, but because time was kind. And when herbs failed, when teas did nothing, when poultices rotted on flesh, death came anyway. Families wept not only for the loss of life, but for the futility of their efforts. The earth had offered them remedies, but those remedies were weak against the weight of disease. This is the harsh truth of Mesopotamian healing. It was a patchwork of hope, superstition, and herbs. Sometimes, by chance, it helped. More often, it only delayed the inevitable, and yet, people returned to it again and again, because when sickness struck, there was no other choice. So when you picture Mesopotamia, do not imagine stocked pharmacies or skilled surgeons. See instead a clay bowl filled with crushed roots, a healer's tired hands mixing powders, and a family praying that bitter taste might bring sweet relief. Herbal remedies carried little effect, but they carried the only hope the people had, and in a land of hunger, disease, and death, even weak hope was precious. If the sickness did not yield to charms, if herbs gave no relief, if prayers were unanswered, then there remained one last desperate path: the knife. In ancient Mesopotamia, surgery was not a matter of precision or sterile tools, it was raw survival, done with bronze blades, sharpened obsidian, and steady but untrained hands. And above all, it was done without anesthesia. No soothing sleep, no numbness, no escape. Only pain. Imagine a man with a festering wound, the skin swollen, heat rising from infection. The healer decides the rot must be cut away. He grips a blade, rinsed in water, perhaps brushed with wine, though it does little to kill the invisible danger of germs. The patient is held down by brothers or friends, his body trembling before the first slice. Then the blade enters, and a scream rips the air. There is no way to soften the agony. Every nerve alive, every second stretched into eternity. Sometimes they drilled into skulls to release pressure, believing evil spirits were trapped within. The sound of stone biting bone, the shock of pain shooting through the body, the helpless struggle of the patient. This was surgery in Mesopotamia. Success meant survival, though often with scars and lifelong weakness. Failure meant death, either from the wound itself or from the infection that almost always followed. The healer's tools were simple: knives, saws, probes of bronze. Bandages of linen soaked in oils wrapped the cuts, herbs packed into open flesh to slow bleeding, but none of it could erase the agony. The patient endured every cut, every stitch, every press of a rough hand into raw skin. Some fainted from shock, others thrashed so violently they had to be tied down. The screams echoed through villages, warning others of what awaited them if illness grew too dire. And yet some surgeries saved lives. A stone lodged in the bladder cut out through brutal force, a shattered bone reset with splints and bound tight, an arrow dug from the chest, leaving the victim scarred but alive. In these rare cases, pain became the price of survival, a debt paid in screams and blood. But for many, the price was too high, and death arrived not long after the healer's blade. Think for a moment what it would mean to endure this yourself. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, no quiet hum of machines, just the hard floor of a mud brick house, the sour smell of herbs, and a blade that bites deep while your body begs for mercy it will never receive. You would hear your own screams, raw and ragged, and feel your strength draining with every drop of blood. There is no pretending here. This was not healing in any gentle sense. This was survival, violent and uncertain. And the strangest part? People trusted it. They feared it, yes, but they also clung to it. Because sometimes, even in all its brutality, surgery worked. And in a world where sickness and injury lurked at every corner, even a chance, no matter how slim, was worth the torment. So picture Mesopotamia not only as the cradle of civilization, but also as a place where healing meant horror, where the line between life and death was drawn with a blade, and where anesthesia was nothing but an unimagined dream. Painful surgeries without anesthesia remind us that survival in the ancient world was not gentle. It was raw, it was merciless, and it was paid for in suffering. Farming in Mesopotamia was never a gentle life. The soil was rich, yes, fed by the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, but the fruits of that labour were not truly the farmer's to keep. Year after year, as the sun baked the land and backs bent low in the fields, there loomed a weight heavier than the heat, the demand for tribute. Kings, temples, and governors all stretched out their hands, and the farmer's harvest was taken before he could even enjoy it. Picture a man standing in his field at dawn, sweat already forming on his brow as he gathers barley. His family waits anxiously, hoping the yield will be enough to feed them through the year. But before the grain ever reaches their baskets, officials arrive. They are not farmers. They do not know the sting of cracked hands or the ache of a back bent for 12 hours under the sun. They come with tall staffs and clay tablets, marking down measures of grain, counting sheep, demanding oil, and they take. Always they take. The tribute was heavy, sometimes half a farmer's harvest, sometimes more. The best grain went straight to the temples, offered to the gods, or at least to the priests who served them. The next share went to the palace, filling storehouses that fed soldiers and scribes. Only after all this did the farmer see what remained, and often it was little. Families survived on scraps, stretching thin meals of bread and dates while the rulers feasted in decorated halls. There was no escaping it. Tribute was enforced with harsh penalties. Fail to deliver, and your livestock might be seized, your fields taken, your family dragged into debt slavery. The land itself was often not owned by the farmer, but by the temple or the king, meaning the farmer was little more than a caretaker, toiling endlessly for someone else's gain. The cruelty of it was sharpened by the sight of plenty. Farmers carried heavy baskets of grain past palaces where musicians played, where golden cups brimmed with wine. They walked barefoot, shoulders stooped, while inside cool halls the rulers enjoyed the very fruits torn from their fields. Imagine the bitterness, a stomach half empty, hands raw, yet watching the wealthy dine on meat and honey. And yet, tribute was not only about greed, it was the lifeblood of Mesopotamian power. The ziggurats, those towering temples that still rise like giants from the earth, were built from tribute. Armies marched, clothed and fed by tribute. Kings carved their names into history with bricks baked by tribute. Civilization itself was stacked on the bent backs of farmers who had little choice but to surrender what they grew. Think of the hopeless rhythm, sowing in spring, sweating in summer, harvesting in autumn, only to see it carried away by others. Then winter comes, food stores already thin, children hungry, parents weary. And yet, when the floods return, the cycle begins again, because survival demanded it. Tribute was not a one-time burden. It was endless, a weight, pressing down every season, every year without escape. So, when you picture ancient Mesopotamia, do not see only its grand temples and mighty kings. See also the fields, wide and golden, where men and women toiled under the pitiless sun, knowing that much of what they harvested would never be theirs. High tribute was the hidden tax of life, the unyielding price of civilization. And for the farmer, it meant that even after days of sweat and aching labour, hunger was never far away. If farming tribute drained the strength of Mesopotamian peasants, another demand awaited them, one carved not in grain but in sweat, stone and blood. The temples that towered above the cities, those massive ziggurats rising like stairways to heaven, were not built by choice. They were raised on the bent backs of ordinary men, summoned from their villages, forced to abandon their fields and labour for the gods they barely had time to worship. Imagine being called from your small home at dawn, just as you prepare to tend your crops. A messenger of the temple arrives, carrying a clay tablet with your name. Your duty is clear. You're to leave your land for weeks, sometimes months, and join the labour gangs dragging stones, hauling bricks, mixing clay in the scorching sun. Refusal is not an option. To resist is to risk punishment, seizure of your land, or worse, slavery. So you go. The work itself was brutal. Bricks moulded from mud and straw had to be shaped, dried, and carried in endless lines. Stones were dragged on sledges by ropes cutting into men's palms, their bodies bent forward as if chained to the very earth. Sweat stung their eyes, their bare feet blistered on hot ground, their muscles screamed with exhaustion. Day after day they lifted, pushed, and heaved, while overseers shouted commands and struck whips to drive them harder. And what were they building? Sacred monuments, yes. Temples to the gods, ziggurats meant to touch the sky. But to the labourers, these were not pathways to heaven. They were prisons of stone, reminders of power. They knew the priest would climb the steps, not them. They knew the kings would claim the glory, not the men who laid each brick with shaking hands. Sometimes whole villages were emptied of their strongest men for temple construction, leaving fields untended and families hungry. Women and children struggled to keep farms alive, often failing. The irony was bitter. The gods demanded temples, but the very people who fed the land starved while building them. Even when a temple stood finished, the burden did not end. More tributes were collected to maintain it. More men were summoned for repairs or expansions. The cycle of forced labour was endless as the toil in the fields. The gods were never satisfied, and neither were their priests. Think of yourself in that place. The sun burns down, your shoulders ache from carrying bricks heavier than your own child, your throat is dry, and still the overseer's voice cuts, sharp, faster, stronger, more. Around you, men collapse, some from heat, some from exhaustion. They are dragged aside, left in the dust, their work replaced by others pulled from their villages. No one pauses. The temple must rise, and rise it did. Even today, ruins of Mesopotamian ziggurats remain, massive and silent, their bricks still holding the ghost of sweat poured into them thousands of years ago. They stand as testaments not just to faith or power, but to the unending sacrifice of those forced to build them. So when you see those ancient structures in your mind, do not picture only the majesty of their steps against the sky. Picture also the men beneath, backs bent, ropes cutting into their flesh, their voices hoarse with exhaustion. The temples may have been dedicated to the gods, but they were built on the unwilling labour of mortals, and for the common people of Mesopotamia, construction through forced work was yet another chain that bound them to suffering. Life in Mesopotamia was not only about tilling fields and giving tribute, it was also about taxes. Clay tablets, etched with neat cuneiform, recorded every bushel of grain, every jug of oil, every head of livestock owed to the state or the temple. These were not suggestions, they were commands. To fall behind on taxes was to invite punishment that struck as hard as any whip, leaving ordinary people with no escape from the state's grip. Picture the scene. A farmer has had a poor harvest. The rains came late, the soil dried too quickly, pests devoured part of the barley. His family already struggles to eat, yet the tax collectors still arrive, their tablets ready, their tall staffs glinting in the sun. They do not care about excuses. The amount written is the amount owed, whether the field bore fruit or not, and if the farmer cannot pay, the consequences are swift and brutal. His tools may be seized, leaving him unable to work his land. His animals may be taken, driving his family deeper into hunger. Sometimes even the land itself is stripped away, claimed by the temple or the crown, and in the darkest cases the farmer, his wife, or even his children could be dragged into debt slavery, forced to serve until the tax was repaid, a repayment that often never came. There was no mercy in the system. Taxes were collected with the same iron hand that built temples and raised armies. To evade them was seen not just as disobedience to the king, but as sacrilege against the gods, for temples too relied on taxes. Defiance was punished publicly, a warning to others. A man caught cheating, the system might be beaten in the marketplace, his debts carved into tablets for all to see, his shame recorded for eternity. Even small delays were dangerous. If a payment was late, interest piled up like stones on the back. Debts doubled, then tripled, until repayment was nearly impossible. What began as a single missed harvest could become a lifetime of bondage. Families handed down debts like a curse, from parent to child, shackled not by chains of iron, but by clay tablets inscribed with figures no one could erase. Imagine the weight of living under such fear. Each day in the field, you bend and sweat, not just for your family, but for the looming shadow of the tax collector. You measure your grain not with pride, but with dread, knowing how much will be taken, knowing how little will remain. And still, you pray the officials will not accuse you of withholding, because accusation alone was enough to destroy a life. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to admire the beauty of Mesopotamian tablets, the order of their records, the precision of their accounting. But to the people who lived beneath them, those tablets were as heavy as stones, each symbol a reminder of debt and punishment. Civilization's order came at the cost of constant fear. In Mesopotamia, the gods were never far away. They were believed to watch from the sky, from the rivers, from the winds that swept dust across the land. They gave life and prosperity, but they also brought droughts, floods, and plagues. To keep them content, people offered sacrifices not as acts of love, but as acts of survival. Appeasing the gods was not optional, it was the heartbeat of daily life. Picture a temple courtyard at dawn, the air thick with the smell of burning incense. Priests in long robes chant as villagers gather, bringing their offerings. A farmer clutches a trembling goat by its horns, guiding it reluctantly toward the altar. This animal is not just a possession, it is food, milk, and labour. Yet today it must be surrendered, its blood spilled to calm the unseen forces that hold power over every harvest and every life. The sacrifices varied. Sheep, goats, cattle, birds, all were laid upon the altar depending on what the family could afford. Wealthy nobles might give oxen, their massive bodies feeding both the gods and the priests who claimed the meat. Poorer families offered doves or small cakes of bread, hoping even a modest gift would earn divine mercy. The act itself was the same, giving up something precious, a fragment of survival, in exchange for protection. And sometimes, the sacrifices were more than symbolic. Historical whispers tell of moments when human lives were offered, especially in times of great disaster. A child, a captive, or a slave could be laid before the gods, their death seen as the ultimate plea for mercy. Whether common or rare, the very possibility of such offerings reveals the depth of fear that gripped Mesopotamian hearts. For the ordinary person, the burden was immense. Imagine watching your best goat, the one that fed your children, dragged away to be slaughtered for a temple feast. Imagine giving up precious grain you had hoped to save for winter, only to see it burned on an altar. Sacrifice was not just religious, it was economic, cutting into survival itself. But to refuse was unthinkable. If you withheld, and the floods failed or the winds destroyed your crops, everyone would whisper that it was your fault. The gods had punished the village for your disobedience. The rituals themselves were dramatic. Priests read the smoke as it rose, searching for signs of divine acceptance. If the flame burned brightly and the smoke rose straight, it was said the gods were pleased. If the smoke wavered or scattered, fear spread quickly. Perhaps the offering had not been enough. Perhaps more was required. And so sacrifice became endless, a cycle without rest. Year after year, season after season, families surrendered part of their survival, to invisible beings who could never be fully satisfied. The gods were mighty, but they were also unpredictable, and the people lived always beneath the shadow of their wrath. Think of how different it feels from our modern idea of worship. For Mesopotamians, devotion was not about comfort or guidance. It was about bargaining with powers too vast and cruel to ignore. The temple was not a place of peace, it was a place of transaction, where life and blood were traded for the fragile hope of safety. For the people of Mesopotamia, the world was never stable. The same rivers that gave them life could rise without warning, drowning fields, sweeping away homes, leaving behind mud and ruin. The same skies that warmed their crops could turn cruel, releasing storms of dust or hail that stripped barley from the stalk, and every time disaster struck, it was not seen as chance, it was seen as wrath. The gods, they believed, had turned their faces away. Imagine standing in a field of ripening grain, the golden heads swaying gently in the breeze. You feel hope rising. This harvest will feed your family through the year. But on the horizon, dark clouds gather. The wind grows sharp, dust stings your skin, and within moments the sky unleashes its fury. Rain pounds the earth, the rivers swell, and in a single day the promise of survival is washed away. You look upward not in disbelief, but in terror. Which god have you offended? Floods were the most dreaded. They came swiftly, without mercy, sweeping across the plains, pulling down walls of mud brick homes, drowning livestock and sometimes whole villages. The epic stories of Mesopotamia, like that of Gilgamesh, remember these floods as divine punishments, meant to wipe out humanity's pride. Each time the rivers raged, people whispered of angered gods demanding greater sacrifice. But floods were not the only terror. Droughts came just as cruelly, the sun blazing down without rain for months. Cracked earth split open beneath farmers' feet, wells dried, and animals collapsed in the fields. Hunger followed like a shadow, and again, people asked the same question. Which god have we angered? Earthquakes, too, shook the land from time to time, and every tremor was taken as a warning. The ground itself seemed to roar, and in that roar, people heard the voice of an offended deity. Even eclipses, those brief moments when the sun or moon went dark, filled hearts with dread. Surely such signs were not natural. They were omens, messages of divine displeasure. And so, daily life carried a thread of fear, woven into every season. Families offered sacrifices not out of love, but out of desperation, hoping to prevent the next disaster. Priests stood as interpreters, telling the people what the gods demanded to restore balance. But the truth was bitter. No matter how much was offered, disasters came anyway. The gods remained unpredictable, their wrath falling like storms from a sky that no prayer could fully control. Picture yourself there. You work all season under the blistering sun. You watch your children go hungry as you hand over tribute. You give your best goat to the temple. And still, when the rains come too heavy or too late, everything is ruined. The helplessness is suffocating. You live not only in fear of hunger or loss, but in the deeper fear that the world itself is against you, ruled by gods who see humans as pawns in their endless games. This was Mesopotamian faith, not gentle, not reassuring, but heavy with dread. To them, natural disasters were not accidents of weather or chance. They were punishments, warnings, reminders of their place beneath the heel of powers they could neither predict nor escape. In Mesopotamia, the gods were everywhere, and because of this, so were their priests. The ziggurat towers may have dominated the skyline, but it was the priests who dominated daily life, weaving themselves into the smallest details of existence. To the ordinary farmer, merchant or labourer, the priest was more than a religious figure. He was judge, interpreter, collector and gatekeeper to the divine, holding the keys not just to worship but to survival itself. Imagine beginning your day at sunrise. Before the plough touches soil, before the first seed is cast, you stop to offer a prayer taught by the priests. If you do not, you risk angering the gods who might withhold rain. When your wife bakes bread, she sets aside a portion for the temple. When your child falls ill, you call not for a healer but for a priest, who arrives with chants and charms. At every step the priest's shadow follows, reminding you that nothing in life escapes divine eyes. The power was not soft. Priests enforced rules with strict precision. They interpreted omens, deciding what actions were allowed, which marriages were blessed, which contracts were valid. A favourable reading could mean prosperity, while a warning omen might halt a journey or ruin a trade deal. In this way, priests controlled not only faith, but commerce, family, and law. Their word carried more weight than reason, because to defy them was to defy the gods themselves. Taxes, too, passed through priestly hands. Offerings meant for the gods filled the temple storehouses, yet from those same storehouses wealth flowed to the priests. Grain, wine, oil, animals, all taken in the name of sacrifice, though not all made it to the altar. Priests lived in privilege while the people who brought offerings lived in scarcity. But who would dare accuse them? To question a priest was to risk divine punishment, a gamble no one wished to make. Fear was the priest's strongest tool. If disaster struck, a flood, a plague, a failed harvest, the priest declared it punishment for sins unconfessed. Families whispered in guilt, wondering what they had done wrong, and the answer, more often than not, was to give more. More offerings, more obedience, more submission to temple authority. Fear kept the cycle turning, binding people to the temple as tightly as chains. Picture yourself in that world. Your child is sick, coughing through the night. You have already given half your grain in tribute, but the priest tells you the gods demand another offering. You hesitate. Your family is hungry. But then he warns, if you do not, the sickness may spread, perhaps even to your other children. What would you do? The answer is inevitable. You give, you obey, you bend. This was not simple devotion. It was control, precise and unrelenting. The priesthood shaped the rhythm of every day from birth to death. Even funerals passed through their hands, for without the proper rites the soul would wander restless. In life and in death, the people were never free from priestly authority. Life in ancient Mesopotamia was fragile, and nowhere was this fragility more visible than in the lives of newborn children. The moment a baby entered the world, its chances of survival were already slim. Disease, malnutrition, poor sanitation, and lack of medical knowledge combined into a cruel lottery where many infants never saw their first birthday. Imagine the scene. A small mud brick home, dimly lit by an oil lamp. A woman labours on a reed mat, surrounded by anxious family members. There is no doctor, no trained midwife with modern skill, only neighbours and relatives guided by tradition, sometimes joined by a priest reciting prayers to the gods of childbirth. The air is heavy with incense smoke meant to drive away evil spirits. Outside, the village is quiet, for everyone knows this moment could mean life or death. When the child is finally born, there is no guarantee of survival. The risk begins immediately. Some infants are too weak, born prematurely or underweight. Others struggle to breathe. And in a world without sterile tools or safe practices, even a simple cut to the umbilical cord could invite infection. Mothers whispered prayers to Nintu, the goddess of birth, hoping she would protect their child, but often the god seemed silent. Even if the baby survived those first critical hours, danger was far from over. Contaminated water, spoiled food, or exposure to harsh weather could bring sudden sickness. Diarrhea, fever, or coughs, ailments we might treat with ease today, were often deadly then. Families might try herbal remedies, or priests might perform rituals to banish unseen demons, but the effectiveness was limited. Death could come swiftly, leaving grief behind like a shadow. The numbers, though not written in precise statistics as we know today, were staggering. Archaeologists studying burial sites find countless tiny graves, evidence that perhaps half of all children died before reaching adulthood, many within their first few years. To be born in Mesopotamia was to step into a world already tilted against survival. The sorrow weighed heavily on families, yet it also hardened them. Some parents refrained from naming a child until it had lived past its earliest months, fearing to grow attached too soon. Others dedicated offerings at the temple immediately after birth, hoping to secure divine favour. Life became a ritual of bargaining. Give to the gods, and maybe they will spare your child. Picture yourself there. You cradle your newborn, its tiny breaths shallow against your chest. You're exhausted from labour, aching in every bone, but relief floods you. Your child is alive. Yet beneath the relief lies fear, sharp and unshakable. You have seen neighbours bury infants. You know the river water is unsafe, but it is the only water to drink. You know fever can strike without warning. And so you rock the baby gently, humming a lullaby, not only to soothe but to ward off despair. This constant threat shaped the rhythm of Mesopotamian life. Families often had many children, not because survival was easy, but because so many would be lost. Childhood itself became precious, fragile, celebrated when it endured yet mourned far too often. And through it all, the gods loomed large. Every illness, every loss was interpreted as divine will. The grieving mother did not simply lose her child, she believed she had failed to please the gods, carrying guilt alongside sorrow. Life in Mesopotamia was never truly peaceful. City-states rose like proud towers, each ruled by kings who dreamed of dominance, and with those dreams came endless conflict. For the ordinary person, war was not a distant story told in songs. It was a reality that marched through the fields, burned villages and filled the air with the cries of the wounded, and for many it shortened life drastically. Imagine yourself in a small settlement. You have spent the day tending barley under the sweltering sun. As evening falls, you hear a sound, distant drums, the rumble of feet, the crackle of fire. Armies are approaching, perhaps from a rival city across the river. They carry spears, bows, and bronze weapons that glint in the fading light. Before you can even gather your family, the clash begins. The wars of Mesopotamia were frequent and merciless. Rulers fought over fertile land, trade routes, and control of rivers. To them, conquest meant wealth, but to the farmers and herders caught in the middle, it meant ruin. Soldiers stormed villages, burned homes, and looted storehouses. If you were lucky, you lost only your crops. If not, you faced slavery, wounds, or death. Injury was a constant shadow for men conscripted into battle. Bronze swords tore flesh, arrows pierced deep, and blunt clubs shattered bones. With no true medical science, wounds that might heal today often turned fatal then. A cut could fester, a broken bone could never set properly, an arrow lodged in the body might mean days of agony before death. Priests muttered prayers, herbal poultices were applied, but the outcome was rarely merciful. The brutality extended beyond the battlefield. Raiders left behind broken survivors, men crippled, women widowed, children orphaned. And in Mesopotamia, to be weak was to be vulnerable. A man unable to work the fields might soon starve. A family without protection might be taken by slavers. Thus, a single war injury could ripple into years of suffering, even for those who lived. Picture the sounds of war as you try to sleep in your mud brick home. The clatter of chariots on the hard earth, the shouts of commanders, the screams of neighbours caught in the chaos. Smoke fills the air, stinging your eyes, and you hold your child close, praying the soldiers pass by. In this world, survival was not just about food and water. It was about avoiding the sword, the spear, the torch. Even those not fighting bore scars of war. Fields left untended meant famine. Herds scattered meant hunger. Temples demanded offerings, even in times of loss, leaving families with nothing. And when peace finally came, it was only a pause before the next campaign. To live in Mesopotamia was to live in the expectation of violence, a constant reminder that your life could be taken not by sickness alone, but by the ambitions of kings you had never met. Archaeological remains tell the same story. Skulls with marks of blades, bones with embedded arrowheads, mass graves holding the fallen, all testify to a life cut short by conflict. For every monument a king built to boast of victory, countless ordinary lives were lost, buried without name, forgotten except in the soil itself. So, when we think of Mesopotamia's grand walls and mighty armies, we must also see the fragility of its people. For them, frequent wars meant not glory but grief, not triumph but tragedy. Every battle carried a price paid in human lives, and the shadow of fatal injury was never far. In this land of kings and gods, the ordinary man was little more than dust waiting to fall. In the world of ancient Mesopotamia, disease was like an invisible enemy, creeping silently into homes and fields, striking without warning, and often leaving no chance of recovery. For the people, illness was not simply a physical affliction. It was a curse, a punishment from the gods, or the work of demons that slipped through the shadows of night. And because true medical knowledge did not exist, cures were more hope than reality. Imagine lying in a mud brick room as fever burns through your body. Your skin is damp with sweat, your breath shallow, and your family watches helplessly. There are no physicians as we know them, no clean instruments, no medicine to bring relief. Instead, a priest may arrive, carrying a bundle of herbs and muttering incantations. He sprinkles water, burns incense, ties charms around your wrist. Yet beneath the ritual lies the quiet truth. There is no cure. Diseases were many and cruel. Stomach illnesses spread from contaminated water. Respiratory infections came with the dust storms. Malaria thrived near stagnant riverbanks. Leprosy, skin diseases, and mysterious fevers plagued whole communities. And with every outbreak, families suffered loss after loss. One cough in the home could soon become a chorus of coughing across the village, until the sound itself became a drumbeat of dread. Without knowledge of germs or hygiene, prevention was impossible. People did not know that flies carried sickness, or that dirty hands spread disease. They blamed instead unseen spirits. A child struck with seizures might be thought possessed by a demon. A wasting illness might be seen as punishment for angering a god. And so, healing was sought not in medicine but in ritual. Herbs were used, yes, and sometimes they brought small relief. Willow bark for pain, licorice root for cough, garlic for infection, but the effectiveness was slight, and often too little, too late. Surgery when attempted was brutal, without anaesthesia or understanding of anatomy. More often the sick were left to prayers, sacrifices, or charms carved with strange symbols. The line between healing and superstition was thin, and most who fell seriously ill never rose again. Picture yourself in such a world. A fever strikes your child in the night. You rush to the temple, begging the priest to ask the gods for mercy. He demands an offering, a goat, perhaps, or a measure of barley. You give it, though you cannot afford to, because you fear the alternative. He chants over your child, waves smoke across the small body, but still the fever rages. And as you sit helpless, you realize that there is nothing more to be done. This helplessness shaped Mesopotamian life. Death was never distant. It lingered in every cough, every wound, every change of season. Families grew used to loss, though the grief never softened. The sick room was not a place of healing, but of waiting to see if the gods would spare or take, and most often they took. Archaeological records tell the same story. Bones show signs of disease untreated, of infections that spread unchecked, of people cut down in the prime of youth. In clay tablets, scribes recorded prayers against plagues, charms for healing, rituals to drive away spirits, but rarely victories. In ancient Mesopotamia, the king was more than a ruler. He was the living embodiment of authority, chosen by the gods, and to question him was unthinkable. His word was law, carved into clay tablets, enforced by soldiers, and whispered in every corner of the city. To disobey was not simply rebellion, it was suicide. Picture yourself in one of the great cities, perhaps Babylon or Ur. The streets are crowded, lined with mud brick homes, and above them all towers the palace. Guards stand at its gates, armed with spears and shields, their eyes sharp for signs of defiance. If the king decrees that taxes must rise, then they rise. If he declares that men must march to war, then they march. If he demands labour for building a temple or a wall, then farmers leave their fields no matter how urgently their crops need tending. There is no choice, only obedience. The king's power was absolute, not because of human law alone, but because it was wrapped in divine sanction. He was believed to rule by the will of the gods. To resist him was to resist heaven itself. When clay tablets declared, "The king has spoken," they carried a weight heavier than any sword. The people bowed not just out of fear of punishment, but out of fear of divine retribution. Yet punishment was always close at hand. A farmer who failed to deliver his share of grain could be whipped, imprisoned, or even executed. A craftsman accused of shorting his work might find his hands cut off. Soldiers who hesitated on the battlefield could be struck down by their own commanders. The law offered little mercy. Every subject, from the humblest slave to the wealthiest merchant, knew that one wrong step could mean ruin. And still, obedience was demanded not only in great matters, but in small. The king's festivals had to be honoured, his victories celebrated, his temples maintained. Even in daily prayers, the people gave thanks for his reign, for without him, they were told, chaos would return. This belief kept the system unshaken. To imagine life without the king was to imagine a world collapsing into disorder. Imagine now your own life in such a place. You rise before dawn not because you wish to, but because the king's men demand grain for the storehouses. You march in the heat, carrying baskets of barley on your shoulders, while scribes tally every handful. You hear rumours of rebellion in a nearby city, and for a moment your heart leaps. Could things change? But then soldiers march through the streets, reminding everyone of the cost of defiance. The dream dies before it begins. For the people of Mesopotamia, freedom was an illusion. Their lives were scripted by powers far beyond their reach. The king's command was the river they floated upon, swift and unyielding. To resist was to drown. To obey was the only way to survive, even if it meant surrendering one's will. In Mesopotamia, religion was not a matter of private belief. It was the framework of daily life, and the priests were its enforcers. They were not merely keepers of temples. They were the interpreters of the gods, the guardians of morality, and the monitors of every routine, large and small. Their influence pressed down like a weight, shaping when people worked, how they behaved, and even what they thought. Imagine waking at dawn in a mud brick home, the faint glow of sunlight slipping across the reeds of your mat. Before you can even eat, you must perform a ritual blessing, a prayer whispered to keep away evil spirits. Who taught you this? The priests. They determined the rhythm of the day, when to plant, when to harvest, when to feast, when to mourn. The temple bells marked time as surely as the rising sun, and every villager's life was bound to those rhythms. But it was not only time they controlled, it was morality. Priests declared what was pure and what was forbidden, what pleased the gods and what angered them. A man who broke a taboo might be shunned or punished, not because of law, but because priests declared him cursed. A woman accused of failing to honour the goddess might be forced into humiliating rituals to cleanse her sin. The rules were endless, and each rule carried fear behind it. Priests also held power over family matters. Marriages were blessed or denied by temple authority. Disputes between neighbours might be settled not in courts, but by priestly judgment, backed by omens and ritual signs. Even sickness fell under their control, for illness was seen as punishment from the gods. Only priests, through chants and sacrifices, could hope to lift such punishment. The healer's hand and the judge's voice were often one and the same. Picture yourself as an ordinary villager. You rise early to work in the fields, but the priest announces today is sacred, a day of rest for the gods. If you disobey and labour anyway, you risk angering both temple and deity. Later, when your child falls ill, you bring an offering of grain to the temple, though your family is already hungry. The priest accepts it, mutters prayers, and tells you to trust the gods. If the child recovers, he takes credit. If not, he blames your lack of devotion. Either way, you remain in his shadow. Even festivals, though filled with music and food, were not escapes from control. They reinforced it. Processions wound through the streets, with priests at the centre, reminding everyone of their place beneath the gods and beneath the temple. Joy was permitted, yes, but always within boundaries drawn by those who claimed to speak for heaven. In this way, freedom was slowly drained from daily life. You did not decide when to work, when to rest, or how to pray. The priest decided. You did not choose what was right or wrong. The priest declared it. And with every choice removed, ordinary people learned to live in obedience, not just to kings, but to the silent, constant authority of the temple. In Mesopotamia, freedom was not a birthright. It was a dream too distant to imagine. For the ordinary man or woman, life was a cycle of service, bound by obligations that left little room for choice. Kings demanded labour, priests demanded offerings, and the land itself demanded toil. To live was to serve, and to serve was to survive. Picture yourself as a farmer. You wake before dawn, not because you wish to, but because your barley fields cannot wait. The sun has not yet risen, and already your back aches. You plant, weed, and harvest. But when the crop is ready, the largest share does not go to your family. It goes to the temple or the palace. You bend beneath the burden of grain baskets, hauling them to storehouses guarded by scribes and soldiers. By the time you return home, your hands are cracked, your body broken, and your children still hungry. Servitude did not end in the fields. When kings announced the construction of a new wall or temple, common people were forced into labour gangs. Farmers, potters, shepherds, all pulled away from their own needs to serve the ruler's ambition. Under the burning sun, they carried stones, hauled clay, and worked until their bodies gave out. There was no protest, no escape. To refuse was to face punishment, and punishment in Mesopotamia was never merciful. Even women lived under layers of obligation. A wife served her husband, yet both were bound to the authority of the temple and the demands of the king. A widow, already grieving, might be forced into temple service, weaving cloth or grinding grain for priests. Children, too, grew into labour as naturally as breathing, their small hands set to work before they had strength enough to resist. From birth to death, every step was measured in duty. Servitude also wore a spiritual mask. Priests reminded the people constantly that their labour was not just for kings, but for the gods. To give grain, to haul stone, to weave cloth, these were offerings, acts of devotion. And so, people bowed twice, once to their rulers and once to the heavens, both chains tightening together. The system was perfect in its cruelty. Work was endless, but it was framed as sacred. Picture yourself in this endless cycle. You finish a long day in the fields, collapse on your mat, and dream of rest. Yet before dawn, soldiers arrive, ordering you to join a labour crew at the riverbank. You want to refuse, you have no strength left, but refusal means a beating, perhaps worse. So you rise, body heavy, spirit hollow, and shuffle into the darkness with the others. You serve because you must, because there is no other path. This was the life of the majority in Mesopotamia, not one of glory but of servitude. Kings ruled from palaces, priests from temples, but the people lived in mud brick houses, bound to burdens they could never set down. Their labour built the walls, filled the storehouses, raised the ziggurats, but their reward was little more than survival. So when we remember Mesopotamia's greatness, we must also remember its cost. The monuments of kings were carved from the sweat of the common people, their names forgotten, their freedom stolen. They were trapped in servitude without end, their lives ground down beneath the weight of power they could never escape.